The rain hammered against the canvas tent somewhere in the forests of northern France, and inside, beneath the glow of a single lamp, a group of German officers sat in silence around a table covered in maps and intelligence reports. The year was 1944, and the war that had once seemed destined to end in Berlin's favor now pressed against them from all sides. The Allied advance had broken through Normandy, and the German High Command found itself engaged in a deadly game of anticipation, trying to predict where the next hammer blow would fall. They studied photographs, analyzed radio intercepts, and pored over every scrap of information they could gather about the men commanding the armies that threatened to crush the Third Reich. Yet among all the names that appeared in those briefings, among all the generals whose movements were tracked and whose strategies were debated, there was one that brought a particular heaviness to the room whenever it was spoken. His name was George S. Patton, and the Germans did not merely respect him. They feared him. This was not the kind of fear born from propaganda or exaggeration. It was something deeper, something rooted in cold tactical reality. German commanders had spent years fighting the Soviets in the East and the British and Americans in the West, and they had learned to read their enemies with a brutal clarity. They knew which generals were cautious, which ones were predictable, and which ones could be manipulated into making mistakes. They had faced Montgomery in North Africa and studied his methodical, grinding approach to warfare. They had watched Eisenhower orchestrate massive operations with careful coordination. They understood Bradley's steady, reliable command style. But Patton was different. Patton moved like a predator, and the Germans understood predators. They had built an entire military doctrine around speed and aggression, and now they found themselves facing a man who had taken those same principles and wielded them with a ferocity that seemed almost personal. In intercepted communications and captured documents, in the private assessments that circulated among field commanders, the message was clear. Patton was the one they could not afford to underestimate. He was the one who kept them awake at night. The story of why Patton earned this reputation begins not with a single battle, but with a philosophy of war that ran counter to almost everything the Allied command structure valued in 1944. While other generals planned meticulously and advanced cautiously, Patton believed that war was won by those who moved fastest and struck hardest. He had no patience for the slow buildup of forces or the careful consolidation of gains. He wanted to attack, to keep attacking, and to never give the enemy a moment to recover. This approach terrified his superiors almost as much as it terrified the Germans, because it was dangerous and unpredictable, and required a level of logistical audacity that seemed impossible to sustain. But Patton had proven in North Africa and Sicily that his methods worked, and by the time the Allies landed in Normandy, the German High Command had already learned to watch for his name on their intelligence reports with a growing sense of dread. What made Patton so dangerous in German eyes was not just his speed but his instinct for exploitation. Most generals, when they broke through an enemy line, would pause to consolidate, to bring up supplies, to ensure their flanks were secure before pushing forward. Patton refused to wait. He understood that the moment of breakthrough was the most critical moment in any battle, because that was when the enemy was most vulnerable, most disorganized, most likely to collapse entirely if pressure was maintained. The Germans had used this same principle during their blitzkrieg campaigns, and they recognized it immediately when they saw Patton doing it to them. He would punch through their defenses and then keep moving, driving his tanks deeper and deeper into their rear areas, cutting supply lines, overrunning headquarters, and creating chaos faster than they could respond. It was psychological warfare as much as it was physical combat, because once Patton was loose in the German rear, every commander had to assume he might appear anywhere, and that uncertainty paralyzed decision-making across entire sectors of the front. The Germans had a particular talent for defensive warfare. They had been forced to develop it as the war turned against them, and they were very good at it. They knew how to build layered defenses, how to use terrain to their advantage, how to conduct fighting withdrawals that bled attacking forces dry while preserving their own strength. They had stopped the Soviets at Kursk and ground the British to a halt in Italy. They understood how to make an enemy pay for every mile of advance. But all of those defensive techniques relied on having time to prepare, time to dig in, time to establish fallback positions. Patton never gave them that time. He moved too fast, and by the time they realized where he was going, he was already past their prepared defenses and forcing them to fight him in open country where his tanks and his aggression gave him every advantage. This was what kept German commanders awake at night. They could plan for a methodical advance. They could prepare for a grinding campaign of attrition. But they could not plan for Patton, because he refused to fight the kind of war they were prepared to defend against. There was a moment in August of 1944 that crystallized everything the Germans feared about Patton. His Third Army had only been officially activated on August 1st, and within days he had begun one of the most spectacular advances in military history. While other Allied forces were still fighting their way through the hedgerows of Normandy, Patton's tanks were racing across France at a pace that seemed impossible. He covered hundreds of miles in a matter of weeks, liberating town after town, capturing thousands of prisoners, and leaving a trail of destroyed German units in his wake. The German command tried desperately to organize a coherent response, but they were always reacting to where Patton had been rather than where he was going. Their intelligence reports became increasingly frantic as they tried to track his movements, and more than once, German units found themselves cut off and surrounded before they even realized Patton's forces were in the area. It was during this period that the German High Command began to refer to him in their communications with a mixture of grudging respect and genuine alarm, because they had never faced an American commander who moved with such disregard for his own supply lines and such confidence in his ability to exploit chaos. What the Germans understood, and what many of Patton's own superiors failed to appreciate, was that his aggressive style was not reckless. It was calculated. Patton knew exactly how far he could push his forces before they ran out of fuel or ammunition. He understood the breaking point of his supply system better than the logistics officers who constantly warned him to slow down. He was willing to take risks that other generals would never consider, but they were informed risks based on a deep understanding of what his troops could endure and what the enemy could not. The Germans recognized this because they had once fought the same way, and they knew that this kind of warfare required not just courage, but a rare combination of tactical genius and operational insight. When they intercepted radio communications and realized that Patton was personally leading his advance from the front, often appearing at forward positions to push his commanders to move faster, they understood they were dealing with someone who lived and breathed offensive warfare in a way that made him uniquely dangerous. The psychological impact of Patton's presence on the battlefield cannot be overstated. German soldiers who had fought on the Eastern Front spoke of the relentless pressure of Soviet attacks, the overwhelming numbers, the brutal attrition. But they spoke of Patton differently. They spoke of him as a force of nature, as something that could not be predicted or contained. There were stories that spread through German units about entire divisions being overrun in a single day, about supply depots being captured before anyone realized they were threatened, about command posts being evacuated in panic as Patton's tanks appeared on the horizon. Some of these stories were exaggerated, but the fact that German soldiers were telling them at all revealed something important about the effect Patton had on enemy morale. He created an atmosphere of uncertainty and fear that went beyond tactical considerations. German commanders had to factor into their planning the possibility that Patton might do something unexpected, something that violated conventional military wisdom, and that uncertainty forced them to be more cautious, to hold back reserves, to second-guess their own decisions. There was a specific incident that German intelligence officers discussed extensively in their post-battle assessments, and it involved Patton's response to the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes in December 1944. The German attack, which would become known as the Battle of the Bulge, was a desperate gamble to split the Allied armies and recapture the vital port of Antwerp. The Germans achieved complete surprise, smashing through the American lines and creating a massive bulge in the Allied front. It was chaos. Units were scattered, communications were disrupted, and for a brief moment it seemed possible that the Germans might actually achieve their objective. In the Allied headquarters, there was panic and confusion as commanders tried to understand what was happening and how to respond. But Patton, whose Third Army was more than 100 miles away from the breakthrough, immediately saw what needed to be done. He told Eisenhower that he could disengage 3 entire divisions from his current operations, turn them 90 degrees north, and launch a counterattack against the German flank within 48 hours. Most of the officers in that meeting thought Patton was exaggerating or grandstanding. Moving 3 divisions across that distance in winter conditions through narrow roads clogged with retreating units and civilian refugees, while simultaneously maintaining operational security and then attacking into the teeth of a major German offensive, seemed logistically impossible. But Patton had already worked out the details. He had anticipated the possibility of needing to respond to a German attack, and he had prepared his staff to execute exactly this kind of rapid redeployment. Within 72 hours, his divisions were hitting the southern flank of the German advance, and the shock of that attack fundamentally changed the dynamics of the battle. The Germans had not expected any significant American response for at least a week, and certainly not from Patton, who they thought was still heavily engaged to the south. When his tanks crashed into their exposed flank, it created exactly the kind of crisis that Patton specialized in exploiting. The German commanders who had planned the Ardennes offensive had made many calculations about Allied response times and capabilities, but they had underestimated Patton's ability to do the impossible, and that mistake cost them dearly. In the German command posts during the Ardennes battle, there was a palpable sense of dismay when intelligence confirmed that Patton's Third Army had arrived. The officers who had been confident about their timetables suddenly had to contend with an enemy who refused to fight according to their assumptions. Patton did not just counterattack, he attacked with a ferocity that seemed to take personal offense at the German intrusion. He drove his forces forward in brutal winter conditions, grinding away at the German flank and forcing them to divert resources from their main advance. Every day that Patton's divisions pushed forward was another day the Germans lost momentum, and in mobile warfare, momentum was everything. The German commanders who had thought they could achieve breakthrough and exploitation found themselves instead fighting a desperate defensive battle on their flank, while the rest of the Allied line stabilized and began to counterattack from the north. The offensive that had begun with such promise collapsed under the weight of its own logistical limitations and the relentless pressure that Patton applied. What emerged from captured German documents and post-war interrogations was a consistent theme. German officers at all levels, from division commanders to field marshals, expressed a particular wariness about Patton that they did not show for other Allied generals. They described him as unpredictable, as someone who did not follow the rules, as a commander who seemed to have an instinctive understanding of when and where to strike for maximum effect. They noted that he appeared to take pleasure in warfare itself, that he seemed to personalize his campaigns in a way that made him more aggressive and more dangerous. Some German commanders admitted that they had made tactical decisions specifically based on where they thought Patton was located, that they had avoided certain operations or reinforced certain sectors simply because intelligence suggested Patton might be planning something in that area. This was the ultimate compliment one military professional could pay another, the acknowledgement that a single enemy commander could influence strategic decisions through reputation alone. There was also a grudging respect in these assessments. The Germans understood professional competence when they saw it, and they recognized in Patton a kindred spirit who valued speed, aggression, and the exploitation of enemy weakness. They had built their own doctrine around these same principles, and they understood better than anyone how difficult it was to execute this kind of warfare successfully. It required not just tactical skill but a particular temperament, a willingness to accept risk and uncertainty, a confidence that bordered on arrogance. Patton had all of these qualities, and the Germans knew that he would never stop pushing, never stop attacking, never give them a moment to recover. This made him fundamentally different from generals like Montgomery, who fought with careful preparation and overwhelming firepower, or Bradley, who advanced methodically and consolidated gains. Those generals were dangerous in their own ways, but they were predictable. Patton was not. The irony, of course, was that Patton's own superiors often failed to appreciate what made him so effective. Eisenhower valued cooperation and coalition warfare, and Patton's aggressive style frequently created friction with other Allied commanders. Montgomery in particular clashed with Patton over priorities and resources, and their rivalry became a constant source of tension in the Allied high command. Eisenhower found himself in the uncomfortable position of managing a general who was his most effective field commander, but also his most difficult subordinate. There were times when Eisenhower considered removing Patton from command, not because of military incompetence but because of the political and interpersonal problems he created. Yet every time that question arose, the Germans provided the answer. When intelligence reports showed that German forces were reinforcing sectors where they feared Patton might attack, or when prisoners revealed that their commanders had specifically warned them about Patton's tactics, it became clear that he was having an effect on the enemy that went beyond tactical victories. He was in the Germans' heads, and that psychological advantage was too valuable to lose. Patton understood this dynamic perfectly. He cultivated his image deliberately, making sure that German intelligence would know where he was and what he was doing. He wanted them to fear him. He wanted them to make decisions based on the possibility that he might appear. This was psychological warfare of the highest order, and it worked because it was backed up by genuine capability. When Patton threatened to attack, the Germans had to take it seriously because they knew he had the skill and the willingness to carry out those threats. When he appeared in an unexpected location, they could not dismiss it as a feint because they knew he might exploit any opening he found. This kept German commanders off balance and reactive, always responding to Patton's initiative rather than executing their own plans. The German High Command had dealt with aggressive generals before. They had faced Zhukov and Rokossovsky on the Eastern Front, commanders who attacked with massive force and accepted enormous casualties to achieve their objectives. But those Soviet commanders fought with different methods, relying on overwhelming numbers and artillery preparation rather than speed and maneuver. Patton was something else entirely. He combined the speed of blitzkrieg with the logistical capabilities of American industry, and he did it with a personal command style that emphasized rapid decision-making and constant forward movement. The Germans had invented mobile warfare, but Patton had perfected it, and now they found themselves on the receiving end of their own doctrine executed better than they could manage with their dwindling resources and shrinking army. By the spring of 1945, as the Third Army drove deep into Germany itself, the German command structure was collapsing. The military that had conquered most of Europe was now fighting for survival on its own soil, and there was no realistic hope of victory. Yet even in these desperate circumstances, German commanders still tracked Patton's movements with particular attention. They knew that wherever he went, he would attack with everything he had, and they knew that their tired, depleted units would not be able to stop him. There were instances in those final weeks where German units surrendered specifically to Patton's forces rather than continue fighting, not because they thought they would be treated better but because they recognized that resistance was futile. Patton's reputation had preceded him so thoroughly that by the end of the war, German soldiers knew his name and understood what it meant when his tanks appeared on the horizon. The question that historians would debate for decades afterward was whether Patton's aggressive style actually shortened the war or whether a more cautious approach might have achieved the same results with fewer risks. The Germans provided their own answer to this question through their actions and their private assessments. They devoted more resources to defending against Patton than they did against other Allied commanders. They reinforced sectors where they thought he might attack. They planned their own operations around the assumption that he would do something unexpected. All of this tied up German forces and diverted attention from other parts of the front, creating opportunities that other Allied commanders could exploit. The psychological pressure that Patton exerted on the German command structure was force multiplier that cannot be quantified in traditional military terms, but it was real and it was significant. What made Patton truly dangerous in German eyes was not just his tactical ability or his aggressive temperament, but his understanding of operational art, the level of warfare that exists between tactics and strategy. He understood how to link individual battles into coherent campaigns, how to exploit tactical success for operational advantage, how to keep an enemy off balance through continuous pressure and unexpected movements. This was exactly what the Germans had done during their successful campaigns in Poland and France, and they recognized in Patton someone who had learned those lessons and could apply them with the industrial and logistical advantages of American power behind him. They feared him because he represented everything they had once been, everything they could no longer match, and everything that made their defeat inevitable. There was a story that circulated after the war, never fully confirmed but repeated often enough to suggest some basis in truth, about a German general staff meeting late in 1944 where the assembled officers were discussing Allied intentions. Someone asked which American general they would most want to see removed from command, and the answer was unanimous. It was Patton, not because they thought his removal would change the outcome of the war at that point, but because his presence made every day more difficult, every decision more complicated, every defensive position more vulnerable. They respected Eisenhower's ability to coordinate vast operations. They admired Montgomery's meticulous planning. But they feared Patton, and in warfare, fear is often more powerful than respect. The legacy that emerged from this dynamic was complex. Patton became a legendary figure in American military history, celebrated for his victories and his quotable personality. But among German veterans and military historians, he occupied a different kind of space. He was the general they had to study, the one whose methods they had to understand, because he had beaten them at their own game. German officers writing their memoirs after the war consistently mentioned Patton as one of the most formidable opponents they had faced, and they did so without the usual qualifications or dismissive comments they sometimes made about other Allied commanders. They gave him what soldiers respect most, an honest assessment of his capabilities based on hard experience. When German prisoners were interrogated about Allied generals, when captured documents were analyzed, when post-war interviews were conducted with Wehrmacht officers, the pattern was consistent. They spoke of Patton differently. They described a general who understood something fundamental about warfare that many of his contemporaries did not, that victory goes to those who maintain the initiative and never give the enemy time to recover. They acknowledged that he had made their job infinitely harder, that he had created problems they could not solve, that he had exploited weaknesses they did not know they had. This was not propaganda or myth. This was the professional judgment of experienced military men who had fought across 3 continents and knew exactly what they were talking about when they evaluated enemy commanders. The fear that German commanders felt toward Patton was not irrational or based on propaganda. It was grounded in tactical reality and operational experience. Every time they faced him, they knew they were dealing with someone who would take risks that seemed insane, who would push forward when conventional wisdom said to consolidate, who would attack when they expected him to defend. This made him unpredictable in the worst possible way, because his unpredictability was backed by genuine military genius and overwhelming material superiority. The Germans could not outmaneuver him because he moved too fast. They could not outlast him because American logistics kept his forces supplied even in seemingly impossible circumstances. They could not match his aggression because their own forces were exhausted and depleted. All they could do was try to avoid him, and even that rarely worked. In the end, what the Germans feared most about Patton was not his tanks or his firepower, but his understanding of what warfare really meant in the modern age. He grasped that industrial war favored those who could move fastest and strike hardest, that defensive warfare was a losing proposition against an enemy with superior resources, that the moment of breakthrough was everything. The Germans had learned these lessons during their own victories, and now those same principles were being used to destroy them. Patton was the instrument of that destruction, the man who took American power and shaped it into something that could shatter German defenses and shred German morale. He was not just a general they respected. He was the general who showed them that the kind of warfare they had perfected could be turned against them with devastating effect. And that realization, more than any single defeat, marked the psychological end of German confidence on the Western Front. Standing in those command posts late in the war, looking at maps that showed Patton's forces driving deeper into Germany each day, German officers must have felt a particular kind of despair. They were facing a man who fought the way they had once fought, who understood the principles that had made them successful, who had studied their methods and learned to execute them better than they could with the resources they had left. The student had become the master, and there was nothing they could do to stop him. That was the fear Patton inspired, not the fear of death or defeat, but the fear of facing an enemy who knew exactly what you were going to do and was always one step ahead, always moving faster, always hitting harder. In the brutal calculus of modern war, Patton had become the equation they could not solve, and they knew it.